an edition of Conscious Living Radio. My name is Mark Caron, and I'm reversing roles today with uh, our good friend and host. Go ahead, Tasha.
Hi, I'm Tasha Sims. I love this. I love that you're the lead. It's great, Mark. I'm excited. Spirit Plant Medicine Conference coming up again. How many years now?
Well, this will be our 11th conference. Our 10th was in 2020 during the pandemic. We did a virtual version, and we're just really excited to be live in person again and being
Hmm.
able to connect and meet with our community members of past and the community members of new in the future. So we're really excited about it. It's out at UBC again at the Nest this year, November 4th, 5th, and 6th. And yeah, we've got a great lineup, 3 days, cannabis ceremony, and a lot of great celebration I think is going to be happening this year.
And I just want to shout out kudos to you and Stephen Gray for making this happen. It's an event, a very heartfelt event, tons of information. Every time I've gone, I've learned something. And at the same time, being amongst people who are, there seems to be in our diversity this common theme of heart, this common theme of caring, and a commitment to growing ourselves and other people. And that's a beautiful environment to be in. So I highly recommend attending. And thanks to you and Stephen for making it happen every year.
Well, thank you for that, Tasha. It's certainly a passion project, and I can speak for Stephen on that and myself. And, again, we're just excited to having everybody back in person. And, we've had comments from some of our speakers over the years, how they just love our conference. They've been to so many different ones, and ours always stood out a little bit different. I think it's the vibe and the way that we do things, because it's not just completely medical perspective. It brings in a lot of the indigenous cultures of the past. We've got a great indigenous representation as well. And it brings together, the professionals, the doctors, therapists, and things, as well as, some of the underground movement, or what we call, the shamans, the seekers, and the people who are looking for something that actually works for them.
And the
And
music and the meditations and the
absolutely.
vendors. I love the
Yeah.
vendors. It's like, oh, time to stock up. That's
Yeah, well,
always
we've
great.
we've got a full round of vendors too, so people can check out the website there. But today I'm really happy and excited to introduce our guest in our program. His name is Benjamin Lightburn. He's a proven entrepreneur and leader specializing in research, development, and commercialization of novel extraction technologies. He is currently applying this experience to the development of the natural psychedelic medicines as the CEO and co-founder of Filament Health, which is one of our sponsors this year, which is something new. We haven't done sponsors in the past. And this year we did invite some select groups to come in and sponsor the work that we're doing. So we're really happy to have Filament Health on board. And just a little bit about Filament Health is that they're a clinical stage natural psychedelic drug development company. They believe that safe, standardized, naturally derived psychedelic medicines can improve the lives of many, and their mission is to see them in the hands of everyone who needs them as soon as possible. Their platform of proprietary intellectual property enables the discovery, development, and delivery of natural psychedelic medicines for clinical development. They are paving the way with the first ever natural psychedelic drug candidates. So, Ben, welcome to the program. We're really happy to have you here today.
Thank you very much, Mark. Very excited to be here.
Great. Well, maybe let's just start by what got you into the world of, psychedelic medicines, what you're doing with Filament Health, because you're obviously got a scientific background. Why psychedelic?
So it's a bit of a long story, but we have 52 minutes, so I'll get a bit into it. I started my career in a facility that was making cancer drugs from plants, actually extracting them, and it's where I learned a lot about how do you extract different high value compounds from different natural sources, and that's where I've ended up spending most of my career. Making ingredients for the pharmaceutical industry, for the dietary supplement industry, for the cosmetics industry. And we have natural extracts in many, many different areas of our daily life, right? Toothpaste has natural extracts, shampoo has natural extracts, cosmetics. one of the things we know is that people want more natural products in their day-to-day life and fewer synthetic products, right? And natural products means finding them in natural sources the way that humans have always done. Something like 80% of the world's population still rely on plants as their primary source of medicine. And this is obviously mostly people from lower income communities where they don't have perhaps the same access to modern pharmaceuticals like we do. So I've been spending my whole career making new different kinds of extracts and commercializing new ways of getting those compounds out of different plants and fungal sources. And a few years ago now, with the kind of rise or the renaissance of the psychedelics industry, it was very peculiar to me and a few former colleagues from different companies, in that the kind of modern psychedelics industry was only going to be about synthetic psychedelic compounds, right? So compounds that are artificially recreated in a lab, psilocybin, DMT, and others. And while there's nothing really inherently wrong with synthetic psychedelic, we, having had careers making natural products, knew that naturals would be better. And that's for a variety of different reasons. Number one is that, well, humans have been consuming psychedelics for thousands of years, and that hasn't been with synthetic psychedelics, right? They've been consuming things that grew in the natural environment around where they live. People experimented, they found what worked, what didn't work, which combinations worked, things like that. So recreating that sort of natural history as much as possible by extracting the compounds from natural sources, we think is very important. But in addition to that, when you make a synthetic psychedelic, like say psilocybin, you only make psilocybin. But when you extract it from a magic mushroom, you get much more than psilocybin, right? You get a host of other compounds, which we call the secondary metabolites, compounds like psilocin, baeocystin, norbaeocystin, the list goes on and on. So when you make something with synthesis, all of that is lost because it doesn't carry through. And it's very possible, in fact, we think perhaps probable, that all these other compounds could work together to provide some kind of benefit. This is what we call the entourage effect, which is sort of very commonly accepted in other industries like the cannabis industry, but still has yet to be proven or really even gain any kind of acceptance in the pharmaceutical industry. And the third reason why we started Filament is, like I said, well, people prefer natural products, right? And some percentage of people will be much more comfortable taking a natural psychedelic substance rather than a synthetic. And if these psychedelic substances continue to show the efficacy and demonstrate the efficacy that they're already doing, without people having the choice of a natural as opposed to a synthetic, then some people may not be comfortable taking it at all. And therefore the adoption will be less. And therefore overall, people will suffer more. So all this is to say, we thought it would be very important that at the very least, people have a choice between a synthetic and a natural psychedelic substance in whichever future market comes to pass. And given that myself and several former colleagues, we had lots of experience making similar products, that's kind of why we decided to start Filament. Mostly because it was a chance to bring all of our skills and expertise making natural extracts to a market which could potentially help hundreds of millions, if not billions of people around the world, right? So that's kind of what brought us to where we are today.
Beautiful. Tasha, do you have a question there?
I'm curious. I think for people who maybe aren't terribly savvy with all the therapeutic effects, some people are, but perhaps we've got listeners who aren't. Let's stick for a moment with magic mushrooms, and maybe you can explain what's happening inside the human body when you're ingesting magic mushrooms, and also what those therapeutic effects benefits could be.
So One of the very fascinating things about psychedelics is the way that they work isn't fully understood. But in general, what's happening when you ingest the magic mushroom, your body takes the psilocybin. The body then transforms the psilocybin into a closely related compound called psilocin. Psilocin is a serotonin analog, which means it sort of like tricks your body into thinking that it's serotonin. And serotonin activates a certain receptor in your body called the 5-HT2A receptor. And after that, it's not really known what happens, but it's at that point that you start to experience the hallucinations. People will say it elicits a state of neuroplasticity. But how it works, or exactly what's happening in your body, is not really known. What is known is that it seems to have quite a bit of efficacy, meaning that it can help with a potentially very large number of different conditions. Probably the most well-known would be depression, right? There's a company called Compass Pathways, which is trying to commercialize synthetic psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression, and is about to go into phase 3 clinical trials. They've shown up till now that psilocybin outperformed the placebo in treating people's depression, but the list of potential indications is much longer than that. So you have substance use, PTSD. You have potentially chronic pain. You have various women's health issues, postpartum depression, peri and postmenopausal dysmorphic disorder. The list goes on, and I think it will continue to grow before we find all the potential ways in which psilocybin could potentially help people.
But you're focused on the psilocin, is that right? Is that one of the developments that Filament Health is working with?
That's correct. So going back to psilocin, both psilocybin and psilocin are actually found in the magic mushroom. But it's the psilocin that causes all the therapeutic and the hallucinogenic effects. But when these compounds were first discovered by Western science, the first thing they did was figure out how to make a way to synthesize them. But it turns out that when you manufacture them synthetically, especially psilocin, is highly, highly unstable. So what that has meant is that all research up till now has been done with synthetic psilocybin. None has been done with natural substances, and no research has ever looked at what we call the direct administration of psilocin. But we think that there are several benefits associated from directly administering psilocin, because you don't have to wait for the time to convert the psilocybin into the psilocin. We think that the onset time could be quickened. Because this conversion can introduce some variability, we think that by giving people the psilocin directly, we can have a more consistent effect. And because this conversion is thought to primarily occur in the gut, if we can avoid having to have that conversion, then maybe we can relieve some of the stomach upset. So we're the first company to make naturally derived psychedelic drug candidates, and the first ones to make a candidate standardized in psilocin, and also get the FDA to authorize putting them into humans in a clinical trial, which is something that's ongoing right now at University of California, San Francisco.
So one question I have, just when it comes down to the synthetic side of things, what I don't understand myself is, how do they create a synthetic psilocin or psilocybin without the natural building blocks?
Well, you essentially, the answer is you can get the building blocks from the chemical supply store, right? Even back in 1958, when this was first done, it was a relatively simple challenge for them to manufacture these compounds synthetically. Obviously, it's much easier today. We have much, much better analytical tools. But even in the 50s, you were able to take something from the magic mushroom. So some samples of magic mushrooms were brought to the lab in Switzerland, and then they were able to find what are the active compounds in those mushrooms, and then relatively quickly, find ways of producing them via chemical synthesis.
Interesting. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but that was Albert Hoffman as well, from the guy who discovered LSD from the ergot, right?
It was, and it was because he became somewhat well known through the LSD was also discovered in a natural source in a fungus. That's why the samples were brought to him from Mexico, so that he could take a look at it, and the rest is history, as it were.
So one of the things Tash and I talked about before we got on with you, and you partly answered the question in regards to when you're making a naturally derived product or a psychedelic, that you still are bringing in all the other great attributes of the mushroom itself without stripping it away. Can you maybe talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So in the mushroom, just like in any plant, and any plant will produce many different active compounds, not just one single isolated molecule. And these plants and fungi develop this way over millions of years, right? In nature, billions of years, who knows? So to try to say that, well, the activity or the therapeutic potential of this plant comes from just one compound out of the many that we can find. Well, think of how many cannabinoids there are, right? We're finding new ones all the time, right? Imagine if instead of cannabis, we had just synthetic THC and no CBD and nothing else. That's sort of the same analogy to extracting from magic mushrooms. It's well known that there are many other compounds in the mushroom besides just psilocybin. And one of the things you could do is extract the psilocybin and purify it so that your final product is only psilocybin. It's natural, but it's isolated, right? So it has only psilocybin. We think that there's not very much point in doing that, because if you do that, you wouldn't really expect there to be much difference between that and a synthetic compound, right? Because they're really two of the same thing, just produced in a different way. So when we first set out to design our processes, we decided very firmly that we would want to preserve the natural ratio of compounds from the magic mushroom and preserve that through the manufacturing process and right into the final product. So in effect, our products have the exact same ratio and quantities of the compounds as if they were present in the magic mushroom, right? The only difference is they're highly standardized. So when you take one of our capsules, you know that you get 25 milligrams of psilocybin, but you also get the same amount of psilocin and norbaeocystin and all these other compounds that you would as if you were to have consumed an equivalent amount of magic mushrooms. The other big difference, of course, is that rather than taking 5 grams of mushrooms, you take a small little capsule, and it goes down a lot easier, and it's easier for you to absorb in your gut.
And are you doing clinical trials with this right now? Is that what's coming up for you? Like specific?
We are. So there's an ongoing clinical trial right now being conducted at UCSF down in California. It's one of the leading psychedelics research institutions globally. In addition, what we're doing is we are providing our psilocybin drug candidate to researchers all around the world. So in the case of academic and philanthropically funded research, we provide drug candidates for free so that they can be studied in the research. And the supply of psilocybin is a major limiting factor for psychedelic research. So this is kind of one way that we give back. But also there's other drug developing companies that are trying to develop psychedelic drugs, and they would rather have our naturally extracted product than the synthesized one. And in that case, we license them our drug candidate and give them the ability to use it. But then we will share in their eventual revenues with the royalty agreement.
Can you paint the picture of a clinical trial for those who don't know? What takes place? How do they find the people? What's the process?
Yeah, that was my question too. I was curious how one gets
Yeah.
involved in something like that. Even.
Yeah.
So running a clinical trial is a relatively major undertaking. It's very expensive. There's tons of rules and regulations that you need to follow, especially because you're talking about administering a controlled substance, right? Remember, officially, in the official government position is that these are highly dangerous substances with high potential for abuse and no potential medical therapeutic benefit, right? So that's kind of like the starting point. So you have to identify a site with a qualified researcher. In our case, it was University of California, San Francisco, and Dr. Joshua Woolley, who's the leader of the Psychedelics Research Center down there. You have to design the study protocol. So how many patients, how many drugs? Is it going to be a double-blind, placebo-controlled study or an open-label observational study? There are many, many, many different decisions that you have to make. Then you have to apply to either the FDA or Health Canada, which govern, regulate, what's permitted to be given, and they give you the final approval on what's allowed in terms of your clinical trial. Then you have to apply to an ethics board. So an ethics board is typically attached to a university, or you might have a private ethics board. They decide whether what you're trying to do is ethical, right? The government typically is more interested in what's safe, okay? Once you've gotten all of that, now you have to deal with the controlled substances aspect, right? Because up until now, you didn't have any approved study. So once you have the approved study, now you can get the controlled substances site license, start getting manufacturing, blah, blah, blah. In the meantime, you can begin recruiting patients. Canada and the US both have an online register of clinical trials where patients can go and see what kinds of clinical trials are happening in their area or with their drug or with whatever indication. And so then those patients will register with the site. The intake personnel at the site will then interview the patients. Remember, you need to have people that are going to show up for multiple visits, that are going to consent to having this therapy, that are going to have a medical exam, all these different kinds of things. And in some conditions, it's very hard to find patients, right? Especially for a rare condition. Once you've done the formal intake, now you can actually begin dosing the patient with according to the protocol, according to however many doses that you give. The patients or the participants, when they come in for their psychedelic therapy, I think it would look a lot like a pretty above board underground. I know that's an oxymoron, contradiction in terms, but it would look a lot like an above board underground therapy session, right? You come into a dosing room, there'd be 2 therapists there, there's a bed and eye shades and music. They try to keep the kind of decorations and the accoutrement relatively plain in these clinical settings because they want it to be kind of repeatable. They don't want the setting to vary that much between different sites. But you also get, professional psychiatrists and psychotherapists and psychologists there to provide the treatment and ask the follow-up questions and study you before and after, whether or not your depression has decreased or increased or whatever is the point of the study, whatever the thing is that they're trying to measure. So it's a very, very involved and complicated, and I should say very expensive process, all of this.
What's your biggest concern in the development of plant medicines as an industry?
Yeah, probably my biggest concern would be the over medicalization. almost everything that's being done right now in the psychedelics industry is towards some kind of a FDA or Health Canada approval as a drug. And of course, that's going to form a very important part of the industry. But as we saw like a month or two ago, when Alberta released its new regulations to regulate psychedelic therapy, they made the rules so that everything had to be under the supervision or the oversight of psychiatrists. But it already takes like 6 to 12 months just to get an appointment with a psychiatrist in Alberta, right? A normal psychiatrist. So if to go get psychedelic therapy, now you have to go not just to a psychiatrist, but to one that also has a psychedelics clinic. What's that going to do to the wait times, right? Also, while all the like clinical evidence and safety in the traditional sense for drug development, all of that is critically important to understand the drug, especially in special populations and in vulnerable populations and people that are on different drugs and different things like that. The difference is that, you know, again, these psilocybin's been consumed overwhelmingly safely for thousands of years, right? Do we really need to put it through thousands of people in a clinical trial when it's already been consumed by millions of people, right? The medical distribution framework risks excluding many, many, many people, right, from accessing the therapy. And so that's why it's good that other markets, such as in Oregon State, that are developing, they very, very specifically excluded anything to do with medicine and anything to do with medicalization from their market. Now, hopefully, you know, that also goes well, and hopefully there aren't any problems, and hopefully things don't go sideways. So, you know, hopefully that we can see progress in one of these markets that's doing it without the whole, you know, pharmaceutical drug development paradox. But anyways, that's my greatest concern. Also that people do things responsibly, right? That we know that these substances put people into a very vulnerable state of mind and physical state. They can be taken advantage of. We know that there's lots of desperate patients out there for all of these different conditions, right? And we don't want people selling snake oil, right, and making promises that are unfounded. That's a problem with the current underground system, right? Anyone can set up a underground clinic and claim whatever they want. It's completely unregulated. And patients are at risk because of the false claims and potentially what could potentially happen to them in an underground therapy setting. And we've even seen that in above ground therapy settings, right? Is patients are at risk. So those are some of the things that worry me.
And so one question I do have is, within any of the research that you're aware of and familiar with, do you see a difference between, say, the underground work or the shamanic work versus the results to clinical type work?
Well, it's hard to compare the results because the results of the underground work, it's completely uncontrolled, right? There's no like standardization. There's no, you know, the way they do it on Bowen Island is probably totally different than the way they do it on Cortez Island, right? Like, I mean, it's not exactly standardized what's going on. So it's very hard to draw conclusions. I think also in the clinical research work and in the like university research settings, I think there is a pretty good cross-pollination with people from the underground, right? So like the people that the universities hire, they're not just some guy off the street that has no experience with psychedelics, right? They're people that have friends in the community or they come from the community. So I think in the university settings, there is although they cannot and would never admit it publicly, right? There is quite a bit of I think cross-pollination like that. They have to start somewhere, right? And these are responsible, well-meaning people at universities. So if you can get valuable experience from the underground and kind of standardize it a little bit, then that's what they're going to do.
I mean, you're talking about a marriage here that needs to happen, or at least needs a conversation. How do you see blending this approach with standardizing things and ethics? Like, where is this conversation around ethics and inclusivity or exclusivity, as you were mentioning? Because if it goes completely medical model, all sorts of people are excluded. How do we marry all those things?
And can I throw in one more part to that, if I may, is the spiritual side of these psychedelic medicines. There's a lot of people who talk about their experience in terms of, oneness and nature and self-realization, spiritual realization, that difference, how that all comes together. Because it's one thing to have a completely medical experience and clinical experience versus this spiritual awakening that has a potential of happening for many people.
Both of these questions are central to the psychedelics rollout, or the broader adoption, or the maybe even legalization, right? I can't go to my doctor and get a prescription for something to increase my oneness with the universe, right? Or but that's a totally valid reason for wanting to do psilocybin, right? Or my loneliness, right?
Yeah.
Or
dose 2. How about dose 2? Because I saw you were featured in there as well, following Lori's story of end of life treatment with Theracil and things like that, and her experience on that path as well, right?
Of course. So that, again, I would point to the forthcoming Oregon market, where you can go and consume psilocybin for any reason whatsoever, right? And then so the first part of the question is like, how do we? But okay, going back to Oregon, you're going to have these facilitators. They're not therapists, right? They're not psychologists. They're the minimum requirements are you need to be an Oregon resident and have a high school diploma. Okay, that's not to say that there's something wrong with that, but are these people? They're going to be saying things to these patients, right? They're definitely going to be saying, oh, it's going to be helping you with this, or oh, you have an issue you want to work on. They're not qualified substance use disorder people, right? Or depression counselors or anything like that. So are they going? But at the same time, are they going to say absolutely nothing, right? Like, I don't know anything about psilocybin. Like I make no statement as to the efficacy. Like, they're not going to say that either. So how do you kind of bridge that gap? We need a whole new framework, right? We need a whole new framework about like what these therapists can say, or what the facilitators can say. What are acceptable reasons for coming? In what circumstances does this need to be administered by a physician? I think that there is no existing framework that fits well for psychedelics. It's totally different than medical cannabis, right? Medical cannabis, you could take it and you go and smoke it back in the day, right? You just consume it at home. But this is totally different because of the need to have like a companion with you at all times. So I think we need a completely new framework. Oregon's the closest. I think Alberta is a good example of over medicalization. They don't even let anesthesiologists do the oversight. They took that power away from anesthesiologists, even though those are the only people trained to administer IV ketamine. So there's an example of regulations making things actually more restrictive for people.
So what is the criteria to be a facilitator in Oregon? It isn't
you need to take their training course. So you need to take a training course from an approved facilitator training organization in Oregon State, and in Oregon resident.
Right, and be an Oregon resident. Well, do you know about that training yourself?
I know vaguely of the requirements. I think it's a 90-hour course. It covers all the elements that you would expect, but I haven't been through the facilitator training requirements in detail.
I'm just curious if it covers what the issue that Mark raised in terms of having an understanding of the transpersonal or spirituality, or, if that aspect is included in the training.
I think it's fair to say that anyone interested in being a facilitator in the Oregon psilocybin market, probably the spiritual nature of things is their prime motivation for part of it. So I think that's probably more than the medical reasons, I think, would be their motivation. I wouldn't be afraid of that not being part of the picture.
No, I would happen to agree with you on that one. Not that I know for certain, but I know a lot of people in Oregon in the work, so it's would stand to reason. Now, I wanted to switch gears a little bit because I also see that you are, within the ayahuasca world, that you're developing a standardized ayahuasca drug candidate. And to me, that kind of blows my mind just based on the history of ayahuasca, how it's been traditionally administered over, millennia. And what does that mean moving forward? Because that's a very, very powerful plant medicine.
It is very, very powerful, both, I guess you could say, physiologically, and has a very, very powerful sort of history and tradition of use. We do have reason to believe that ayahuasca may be better for certain people experiencing certain conditions than psilocybin, although the jury's still out on that. The fascinating thing about ayahuasca, or the most fascinating thing to me about ayahuasca, is that it's an extract of two different plants, right? One of them contains DMT, and the other one contains these compounds called the beta-carbolines. DMT, when you consume it orally, like when you eat it, the body degrades it very quickly, and that's due to enzymes, or an enzyme called monoamine oxidase. But the traditional people and the indigenous people in the Amazon, they actually discovered that when you consume the DMT containing plant along with another plant that contains the beta-carbolines, the beta-carbolines actually block this enzymatic breakdown of the DMT. So the DMT is inactive essentially when you consume it on its own, but when you consume it with this other herb, it prevents the breakdown of the DMT, and therefore the DMT is bioactive. Isn't that just like totally fascinating, right? Yeah. Like, if that doesn't tell you all you need to know about humans turning to the natural world to like figure out medicines and figure out what's going to do this and that, and the fact that they found that you can only by combining these two things, this other thing becomes effective, right? Yeah, question?
Oh, no, I was just going to say, yeah, it always fascinates me when I hear these stories and look into the history, how, these medicine men over, like, say, thousands of years are communing with nature and plants to get this information. Because, not just ayahuasca, but you look at combo and, other plant medicines throughout the Amazon, how they've discovered these things is always just mind-blowing to me.
Yeah. So the other interesting thing about ayahuasca is that rather being given as a whole plant or herb, as like with a magic mushroom, the traditional way to prepare it is actually to make a water extract, right? Is to make a brew, a tea, a decoction. So the traditional use of this product, unlike with magic mushrooms, although a lot of people do extract mushrooms before consuming them, mostly people consume magic mushrooms, whereas with ayahuasca, it's all consumed as an extract. Now, the issue stems from the fact that, again, every extract is prepared completely differently, right? So there's actually been a fair amount of research done on ayahuasca, traditionally administered ayahuasca in Peru and other places in traditional ceremonies, and they'll go and they'll measure the amount of DMT and the amount of beta-carbolines that the different people are getting. And you see that in the same session, different people will get up to 10 times different the amount of the DMT, right? So it's very, very, very variable, right? And this could be that starting plant material has different amounts. It could be that the extraction process that was used was different, or the water was hotter, or the traditional ways for the shaman to actually taste the brew that he's making. Taste is not a very reliable indicator of the presence of DMT or the beta carboline. So there's a lot of variables that can contribute to the overall variability. Like, did you stir the pot before you drank it? You know, many different confounding variables. One of the keys to any kind of research, pharmaceutical research, is that the product must be standardized, right? You have to give the same product every time. Otherwise, you can't draw any conclusions, right? Because everyone got something different, right? You will get little to no information about whether a product works. So our goal is to make a standardized product so that some of these benefits that appear to be overwhelming in their sort of anecdotal reporting on PTSD and substance use disorders, without a standardized product, we can't actually get any real tangible evidence for the treatment of any of these conditions. And so that's what we're doing. We've gotten various samples of the herbs from different tribes, in fact, in Peru. We're working with Dennis McKenna and his team to actually procure a lot of these herbs from the jungle. We're having some shipments are en route right now, and we've actually begun extracting the different compounds and choosing a level of standardization consistent with what's already been reported in the research, and also doing so in a way that we think we can get the FDA on board to approving its administration in a human clinical trial.
What's the key to sourcing raw materials responsibly?
Oh, there are a lot of keys, right? First and foremost would be the sustainability of the source, right? Is this an endangered species, right? Like, is there some like limited amount of it available, such as with perhaps like the peyote cactus or even the iboga plant, right? So that's number one. You're never going to, well, at least a scrupulous person would never start sourcing their botanical drug from a plant species that risks going extinct. A few years ago, or a few decades ago, I guess now, there was a cancer drug that was made from the inner bark of the Pacific yew tree. It's a drug you may have heard of called Taxol or paclitaxel. And so there was this rush to go and chop down mature yew trees in the forest. But it turned out it required something like 6 mature trees to make one chemotherapy course for one patient. And of course, if you're thinking like lives per yew tree, it still makes sense. You're going to do that. But before long, all the yew trees are going to go extinct, right? And that's what actually was beginning to happen. So a prohibition was put on, and this is in the West, right? This is in Canada. This was happening. So you can imagine what's been happening with some of these stories in less regulated environments in South America or Africa or wherever. So anyway, long-winded way, the number one thing is sustainability of the source. Number two, if it's like a culturally sensitive plant or medicine, you want to be sure that you're working with people on the ground that, again, are sort of keepers of this knowledge of this plant, are okay with you, taking it, right? At the same time, like you can provide them with income, right? You can buy it off them for good money. Some of these people are okay with that. Some prefer not. That's okay. So you find a reliable partner on the ground that has an ample supply. In the case of the ayahuasca vines, it has grown to a point where it's semi-cultivated, if not outright cultivated in many cases. The other things that you have to look at is how variable is this supply, right? If I get it in January, it's going to be completely different than if I get it in July. Plants are are delicate, right? One that grows on one side of the valley will have different amounts of the content of the compounds as if it grows on the other side of the valley, or if it's rainy, or if it's sunny, or what have you. So you need to get many different samples to get an idea of how variable the content of these herbs are. And then there's sort of the mundane things, like, does it have pesticides? Does it have heavy metals? Does it have all microbial contamination? Can you get the export certificate? Can you get the import certificate? Can you get blah, 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 blah. So you get into the boring functional stuff pretty quickly. So there's this whole vendor qualification program that's required anytime that you're sourcing botanical raw materials, especially from South America or other more remote jurisdictions.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Well, there's certainly a lot to consider when we look at these medicines versus, especially from our Western perspective, as opposed to the day where you would just go out, and BC used to be prolific with magic mushrooms, and they're still around, where you could just go pick them and do your own thing. And, same as in the jungles of the Amazon, right? So there's a lot there. Now we are running short of time. We're near the end of our time. First, I wanted to thank you, Ben, and Filament Health for the work that you are doing in this research at a time in the world that, with the, just the addiction and depression and all of these things that are kind of plaguing our society. I thank you for doing some of this pioneering work in something that I personally think has a huge impact for humanity. And that's part of the theme of our conference this year is, psychedelics in a planet of transition, and how do we, move forward in a great way so that people can live just really a more enjoyable, loving, peaceful, and inspired life, without all these other ailments. So thank you for the work you're doing.
Well, I appreciate it, and we couldn't ask for a more fulfilling, rewarding, interesting job, right? We literally grow magic mushrooms legally, right? And we give them to people who are suffering from many different conditions. So it couldn't be we couldn't ask for a better job.
Beautiful. Tasha?
Well, just best case scenario, your vision painted from including your heart, because I know you've got a lot of scientific considerations and everything else, but if you can also include your heart in your vision or your wish for all of us in the future in our relationship with plant medicines and how it might look, this standardizing of it all.
It will never come without some kind of broader regulatory framework, but we've proven that we can legalize cannabis without the sky falling down. We're slowly coming to the realization that the war on drugs is an abject failure, and all it does is have people murdered in South America and Mexico, right? Meanwhile enriching criminal enterprises. So this whole prohibitionist mindset needs to go. People need different options. I mean, people are dying of the opioid overdose epidemic on a daily basis. People are literally dying in the street, right?
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that psilocybin will immediately cure all of them, but if there's even a shred of hope that it does, then we need to do everything we can, right away, as soon as we can, right? We need to increase the number of tools in the toolbox, because right now the toolbox is empty, right?
Yeah.
And it's getting worse.
It's a crisis, a mental health crisis for sure.
It's a mental health crisis, right? 1 in 5 North Americans now will experience a serious mental health episode by the time they're 40 or 50. The results are, no pun intended, depressing, right? And with a substance that no one has been able to pin concretely even a single death from overdose on, right? So like, where's the risk reward is seems to be unimaginably favorable, right? So I don't
And
know.
it's nature, right? Dennis McKenna and I have had a few conversations, and we always come to the conclusion is like, whoever gave man the right to make nature illegal anyways? Like, where do we get that in our heads to be able to control that, especially something that definitely has a historical reputation, and that we see in our modern times work for so many different things.
Yeah, I saw a meme one time, and it was something like God is shaking his head, exasperated at humans for, making plant medicine illegal. And he's like, I gave you the tool, and then you made it illegal. Like, what are you thinking, right?
All right.
Yeah.
Well,
Absolutely.
let's keep up with the empathic leadership, because that's what I'm hearing coming from you, and just this whole idea of dissolving fear. It's not based in fact. Hopefully, as more and more studies keep being done, that people will relax a little and open to experiences that can be helpful. And again, the Spirit Plant Medicine Conference coming up November 4th, 5th, and 6th is a great place to continue these kinds of conversations. Make sure y'all come down, and the Friday starts in the day, right?
Start
Take
at
time off.
1:30 on Friday, and we actually close on Friday as with dose 2. We're going to be showing dose 2 as a buy donation opportunity for some of the people who haven't had the opportunity to see it. They'll be able to see it there. We have cannabis ceremony as always Saturday evening, and one of the reasons for that is because we like to believe education, experience, transformation. We can have all the education in the world, but it doesn't mean we're going to have an experience that we're going to use to transform our lives, right? And it's one of the ways that we can safely and legally bring an experience to people. It's led by Stephen Gray, music by Shine and Curtis Andrews. Vanessa's there, and it's a great community. We're expecting upwards of 600 people live in person from all different walks of life. They're coming from all over the world, and it's a great gathering of like-minded people for different, just in different ways. And that's something that we're really excited about. Oh, that's my timer.
Tickets are available. I think all the links to this podcast will be on consciousliving.radio.org. And of course, you can go to spiritplantmedicineconference.com.
Yeah, that's our .com, spiritplantmedicine.com.
I thought you said and I went, oh, there's a new one.
No. And of course, Filament Health will be there. They'll have a table. They'll be there to answer your questions. You can meet Ben and his team as well. And it's just a great opportunity to really, educate ourselves in a way that, we can help create change, not just for ourselves, but for everybody in our lives as well.
And the planet, the collective.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
Thank you, Ben, for joining us today.
Yeah, my pleasure. Yeah, it was very nice to talk to you both.
Awesome. Well, we'll hope to see everybody at the conference. And until next time, it's Mark Ron signing off with the Spirit Plant Medicine episode of Conscious Living Radio. Thanks, Tasha, for joining me today.
That was fun. Thanks for asking.
My pleasure.
Bye, everyone.